This video is sponsored by Connell Guides. To get your hands on the most intelligent study guides on the market for GCSE and A-level English literature, as well as GCSE and A-level history, visit connellguides.com and use code RS15 at checkout for 15% off your order.
What can we say about the theme of power and authority in William Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet? Let's find out. What's going on, Revision Squad? DystopiaJunkie here with another English literature revision video for you. And in this one, we're going to be thinking about how the theme of power and authority is presented in William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. To do that, we are first going to unpack what your exam boards or teachers might mean when they ask you to think about the theme of power and authority in Shakespeare's play. After that, we are going to examine 10 quotations from Romeo and Juliet and discuss how they relate to the theme at hand, analysing language and incorporating context as we go. Right at the end of the video, I will pose a big question for you to think about, and if you're feeling brave enough, answer in the comment section down below. I hope that all of that will help you out as you study or revise Shakespeare's play. If you find anything I say in this video to be useful, please do let me know. You could give it a like, write a comment on it, share it around with anyone else who you think might benefit from watching it, and, if you aren't already, you could subscribe to my channel as well. Okay, so this video is about the theme of power and authority in Romeo and Juliet. Just what exactly might your exam boards or teachers mean by this? So the theme of power and authority is quite a nice one because it can mean lots of different things, meaning that if you are asked to write about it, there are many different ideas you could choose to consider. For example, power and authority can relate to societal power, social status and wealth, given that wealthy, reputable characters in Shakespeare's play also tend to be the ones who make the rules and boss people around. On a smaller scale, power and authority can manifest within the family unit. As such, if you are asked to write about how this theme appears in Shakespeare's play, you could consider the relationships between parents and their children, or the relationships between senior family members and junior family members, and where power or authority might be evident in them. Speaking of relationships, you could also consider the power dynamics and power imbalances in relationships if you are asked to write about power and authority in Romeo and Juliet. In other words, who bosses who around in which relationships? Which relationships appear to be relatively equal? Power and authority could also relate to physical power and authority, otherwise known as strength, violence and aggression. This physical exertion of power gives an interesting alternative to some of the more psychological aspects or sociological aspects I have so far mentioned. Furthermore, power and authority does not just have to include humans. What about the divine or metaphysical? In other words, what about God, religion, fate, and the stars? If these entities are shown to be more powerful than people, then you could definitely write about them with this theme in mind. Last, you could even think about how powerful emotions have authority over people in Shakespeare's play. As such, you could include discussions of love, loyalty, and hatred in an essay about this theme. Now, that final aspect of power and authority is something that I think I have covered pretty extensively in several of my videos already, such as the ones about love and conflict and violence, so I won't be discussing it explicitly in this video. However, the other 5 aspects, which I am calling societal power, familial power, power dynamics in relationships, physical power, and metaphysical power and divine authority, are things that I will be focusing on, with each aspect having a couple of quotations attached to it in this video. So then, it turns out that the theme of power and authority can mean quite a bit, but which quotations could you choose to analyse if asked to write about it? Okay, so let's begin by considering two quotations that relate to societal power, as I've called it. Our first one occurs in the play's opening scene and can be found in two lines said by Prince Aeschylus after he has broken up the brawl between the Montagues and Capulets, which are: "If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace." Here, societal power is linked with the ability to establish rules and the consequences of not meeting them. You see, in the top line, Prince Aeschylus sets a rule, which is that the Capulets and Montagues must not disturb our streets again, and then in the second line, he explains that their lives shall pay the forfeit for ruining Verona's peace. In other words, Prince Aeschylus says that if they are caught fighting again, they will be executed. Here, we could say a few different things about societal power. First, you could say that it manifests in the prince's confidence, for his use of the strong modal verb shall suggests that his decision about the Capulets and Montagues' punishment cannot be swayed. Second, because Prince Aeschylus rather unemotionally asserts through a declarative sentence that the Montagues and Capulets will be killed if they are caught fighting again, you could argue that societal power is associated with violence or that it should not be challenged. Third, you could in fact argue that societal power is presented as quite forgiving in these lines. Now, I appreciate this sounds a bit odd, given that Prince Aeschylus has literally just threatened to kill the Montagues and the Capulets, but bear with me. These two lines are pre-modified by the conjunction if, which evokes the conditional mood. In other words, Prince Aeschylus tells the family what will happen in the future if they do a certain thing. This means that he is in fact giving them a second chance to change their behaviour, suggesting a sort of kindness from the prince. Without such forgiveness, the prince may have instead just killed the Capulets and Montagues for once again engaging in violence at the start of the play, which certainly would have made it much, much shorter. So there you go. These two lines can be interpreted in at least three different ways, with the theme of power and authority in mind, for they suggest that societal power is confident, violent, or forgiving. For our second quotation related to societal power, we're going to hop towards the end of the play. I will be jumping around the play quite a bit in this video, so apologies if that messes up your note-taking at all. Anyway, our second quotation comes from Romeo when he persuades the apothecary to sell him the poison with which he kills himself. The apothecary protests, telling Romeo that selling such a concoction is illegal, and so their will, their mind, their conscience, that sort of thing, will not allow it, to which Romeo retorts, "I pay thy poverty and not thy will." Here, I would say that societal power, and Romeo especially, is presented very negatively. The juxtaposition between pay and poverty highlights the enormous wealth disparity that exists between Romeo and the apothecary, thus giving the younger Montague societal power over the vendor because he is much, much richer. When Romeo asserts that he is paying the apothecary's poverty and not their will, Shakespeare creates the impression that Romeo is taking advantage of the vendor's lack of wealth so that he may get what he wants. In other words, Romeo is throwing money around, perhaps out of desperation, and splashing the cash in the sort of way that a spoiled, privileged brat might do. Furthermore, because Romeo disregards the apothecary's will, Shakespeare suggests that people with power are careless, selfish, or are dismissive of the less fortunate, which may perhaps be his way of making a slight social comment about class in Elizabethan England. Now let's consider how familial power manifests in Shakespeare's play. To do this, we are of course going to turn to the figure of Lord Capulet and consider two lines that he says early on in the play in response to Paris's request to marry Juliet, which are, "My child is yet a stranger in the world. She hath not seen the change of 14 years. Here, Shakespeare dramatises familial power in Elizabethan England, for it was commonplace for high-status fathers to marry off their daughters in exchange for money, land, titles, and social status. As such, Lord Capulet's two lines see him politely declining Paris's request, with the excuse being that Juliet is a stranger in the world because she is not yet 14 years old, even though it was not unusual for girls of this age to have their marriages arranged in Shakespeare's time. Now, an Elizabethan audience and a modern audience will probably react to this in different ways. Shakespeare's original audience would have considered it to be pretty normal for a wealthy father to be discussing his daughter's wedding prospects without consulting her first, and his polite rejection of Paris's advances may suggest that he is a shrewd negotiator because he does not accept this first offer for Juliet that he receives. But what about a modern audience? Well, I suppose once they have gotten over the shock of thinking about such a young teenager even being considered for marriage, they could think that these lines present familial power as being quite controlling, given that Lord Capulet is, after all, making decisions about Juliet's future without asking her first. Alternatively, somebody today could argue that these lines present familial power as being somewhat protective. Through calling Juliet a stranger in the world and emphasising her young age, Lord Capulet creates the impression that she is naive and lacks worldly experience, and so she requires protection and shelter. This appears to largely inform his rejection of Paris's proposal, and so perhaps he just wants Juliet to grow up a little bit and experience more of the world before he marries her off. We've got two quite conflicting views here, which are that familial love is presented as controlling or that it is presented as protective. These two viewpoints aren't completely incompatible. Being overprotective is arguably a form of control after all, and so you may choose to actually discuss both of them in an essay that you write. Showing alternative viewpoints and carefully evaluating them is key to achieving a high grade after all. For the sake of an argument, let's pretend we went with the analysis that familial power is presented as protective when Lord Capulet politely declines Paris's request to marry Juliet. The opposite of this is presented later on in the play when Juliet tells her parents that she refuses to marry Paris, who they have now agreed can marry her after all. Upon hearing Juliet's refusal, Lord Capulet responds with, "Speak not, reply not, do not answer me. My fingers itch." Here, familial power is presented as abusive on two counts. First, Lord Capulet's list of 3 commands, speak not, reply not, do not answer me, is psychological abuse in that it denies Juliet her autonomy and sense of personhood. It strips her of all power and of her voice because Lord Capulet completely shuts her down. Second, we can see that familial power is associated with physical abuse. For Lord Capulet's declarative sentence, "My fingers itch," see him threaten to slap Juliet because he is so angry with her for disobeying him. As such, we get quite a negative presentation of power and authority in these lines, because they demonstrate that when Lord Capulet's fatherly authority has been challenged, he tries to re-establish it by resorting to violence, another manifestation of power. Okay, let's have a think about the power dynamics in the play's relationships now. The first relationship that I would like to consider is the one shared by Romeo and Juliet, which we will do by looking at something Juliet says in the balcony scene, which is, "Oh, swear not by the moon, the inconstant moon." In this line, I am really struck by how Juliet rejects Romeo's romanticised language and commands him to speak in more plain terms. Her rejection of his romanticised language is first evident in not, and is reinforced in how she uses the adjective inconstant to describe the moon. By asserting that the moon is inconsistent and ever-changing, Juliet dismantles Romeo's overly romanticised language by implying that if he swears his devotion to Juliet to the moon, his love will likewise be inconsistent. Her command of Romeo to speak in more plain terms is implied by this rejection of romanticised language, but it is also apparent in how she tells him to swear not by the moon, which takes on the form of an imperative sentence. But how does this relate to power and authority? Well, this line suggests to me that Juliet is the more powerful or dominant person in their relationship, given that she seems quite comfortable in ordering Romeo what to do and how to speak. This sees her challenge gender norms in Shakespeare's time, given that the patriarchal nature of Elizabethan England demanded that women were subservient to their spouses. As such, Juliet's command of Romeo may have shocked a Shakespearean audience, whereas today, we might not even notice this supposed subversion of historical gender norms. Let's focus on Juliet once again as we continue to think about power dynamics in relationships. This time we are going to think about her relationship with the nurse. Now, given that Juliet, broadly speaking, is upper class and her nurse is lower class, and given also that Juliet's nurse is literally employed to be subservient to Juliet, you would probably expect there to be a significant power imbalance between the two characters. However, is this the case? Let's have a quick look at some dialogue they share, which is: "Nay, come, I pray thee, speak, good nurse." "Jesu, what haste? Can you not stay a while? Do you not see that I am out of breath?" Is there a significant power imbalance between the two characters here? No. Whereas Juliet boldly commands Romeo in the quotation we looked at just a moment ago, her attempted command of the nurse is modified by politeness markers here. "I pray thee" is sort of like a Shakespearean equivalent to "please" or "I beg you," whereas her repetition of "good" softens her attempted command some more through flattery. And yet the nurse does not do as Juliet asks. Rather than update Juliet on Romeo, which is what the young Capulet craves at this moment in the play, the nurse tells her to calm down and allow her to catch her breath, thus delaying the news that she will tell. Now, knowing the nurse, this will be done in a somewhat humorous, teasing way, and so when combined with her slight disobedience of Juliet's authority, we get the impression that there really isn't much of a power imbalance in their relationship at all. Now, why might this be the case? Why is there seemingly no power imbalance between Juliet and her nurse, even though societal norms would dictate that there should be one? I believe that it is the strength of their friendship, their close, near mother-daughter relationship, that is the cause here. And so perhaps Shakespeare is suggesting that strong personal relationships are able to transcend the power imbalances expected by social norms. Alright, now let's think about how physical power, or violence, is presented in Romeo and Juliet. Now, of course, I do have a whole video on conflict and violence in Shakespeare's play, so if you are after some extra quotations that are related to this subcategory of power and authority, I do recommend that you check that out. So then, let's think about how Tybalt and his presentation at the Capulet ball, so that we may consider the relationship between power and authority and violence in Shakespeare's play. We're going to look at one line from him, which is, "Fetch me my rapier, boy." Here, we learn that societal power enables physical power. In this line, we see that Tybalt is commanding his personal manservant, as indicated by the noun boy, to go and get his sword so that he may fight the Montague that he has recognised at the party. The fact that this line is a command is evident in the verb fetch, which establishes the imperative mood in it. The fact that this command is centred on Tybalt's rapier suggests that societal power and physical power are closely related. Furthermore, it appears that physical power and the desire to enact it overpowers Tybalt's ability to behave himself at the Capulet's ball and respect societal norms, which might perhaps suggest that, for Tybalt at least, physical power is the more powerful, persuasive, or tempting form of power. But that is not to say that physical power is a purely negative thing in Shakespeare's play. Let's have a look at Juliet's final lines, which are, "O happy dagger, this is thy sheath, there rust, and let me die." Implied by these lines is the hidden stage direction Juliet stabs herself, which is arguably the ultimate form of physical power, for Juliet has overcome her own body's drive to continue to live. So Juliet kills herself in these lines. Great. So what? Well, I interpret these lines as demonstrating that Juliet has used physical power to reclaim her sense of personhood and autonomy and allow her to be the ultimate authority figure in her own life. You see, by making the choice to commit suicide and, she believes, be reunited with Romeo in death, Juliet has rejected Friar Lawrence's plans, her family's power over her relationship status, and the pressure applied to her by Veronese society. As such, physical power is given a positive presentation at the end of Shakespeare's play because it has enabled Juliet to break free of the power structures that seek to control her throughout it. With the theme of power and authority in mind, we now turn to our final subcategory of power in Shakespeare's play, which I called metaphysical power and divine authority earlier in this video. To do so, we are going to focus on Friar Lawrence for a couple of quotations, given that he serves as the play's chief religious figure. So, for our first quotation, let's have a look at a couple of lines he says shortly after his introduction, which are, "Within the infant rind of this weak flower, poison hath residence, and medicine power." So why have I picked these lines with the theme of power and authority in mind? First, let's remember that Friar Lawrence is the most religious character in Romeo and Juliet. This is important because it means that he can be interpreted as being God's representative in the play. As such, when Friar Lawrence juxtaposes poison and medicine in these lines and shows himself to be a wise, knowledgeable character because he knows a lot about plants, Shakespeare simultaneously highlights God's omniscience. The same effect is achieved when Friar Lawrence inadvertently foreshadows, through the same instance of juxtaposition, the second half of the play, in which Juliet consumes a potion to appear dead and Romeo kills himself by drinking poison. As much as Friar Lawrence may not be able to foresee future events, God is not only capable of such a feat, but, some Christians believe, actually predetermines what those future events will be. As such, the friar's accidental foreshadowing of the play's second half may have been Shakespeare's way of alluding to the power of God to predetermine what happens in people's lives, which ultimately makes the divine much more powerful than mortal man. A similar idea is evoked late in the play. Once Friar Lawrence's efforts to reunite Romeo and Juliet have spectacularly failed, he states, "A greater power than we can contradict hath thwarted our intents." These lines suggest that God, fate, or some other metaphysical or divine entity is more powerful than man is, an impression that is created through the comparative adjective greater and verb thwarted. This second word in particular creates the impression that no matter what people plan or what they may try to do, a superior force will always overpower them and ensure that something else will happen. Through ending his play with such a demonstration of divine and metaphysical power, Shakespeare may have been attempting to remind his largely Christian audience of their place in the world, and that they must always respect authority, at least when it comes from God or some other superhuman entity. And of that quotation discussed, that is my analysis of the theme of power and authority in Romeo and Juliet complete. But before moving on, I've got a quick question for you to consider. And that question is, of all the forms of power and authority in the play, which is the weakest and why? Why do you think Shakespeare presented it as the weakest form? Now, what you do with that question is entirely down to you. You could choose to use it to form the basis of a flashcard or mind map. You could use it to spark discussion and debate with your friends and classmates if you are working together. You could even use it to prompt a short evaluative paragraph. And do you know where would be a great place for you to write that paragraph? Yep, you've got it, the comment section down below. I always love reading the ideas that you lot come up with, and if you are feeling brave enough to share your ideas with me, I'll be sure to respect that by giving it some quick feedback too. So why not give it a go? I look forward to reading what you have to say. And with that big question still lingering in your mind, I guess it is time for me to wrap up this video. Genuinely, I really do hope that you have found this video to be helpful and that you feel a bit more confident when it comes to Shakespeare's play as a result of watching it. If this video has indeed helped you out, please do let me know by giving it a like, writing a comment on it to let me know, sharing it around with anyone else who might benefit from watching it, and subscribing to my channel if you haven't done so already. All of that lovely stuff helps me out loads, and it helps me to reach even more people with my content, so I really do appreciate it. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. Please remember that, as always, I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are revising, please do remember to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be. So what can we say about power and authority in Shakespeare's play? Well, I would argue that it is presented as an incredibly complex theme that manifests in the play's depiction of societal power, familial power, power imbalances in relationships, physical power or violence, and also in divine authority and metaphysical power as well.